Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men is easily the most immersive film I've ever seen, and the way it achieves this is a bit more complicated than it first appears. So, odds are if you're a film buff, when you think Children of Men, you think long takes, but there's a lot more to this film's immersion. Don't get me wrong, these long takes are absolutely jaw-droppingly amazing on both a technical and artistic level, but what sticks out just as much in my mind is the sound design that accentuates the most important things to take away from those long takes. The sound in every second of this film had some consideration put into it. Look at this scene, for instance. The purpose of this scene is, obviously, to get our main character, Theo, into the fish headquarters, but director Alfonso Caurón takes this opportunity to flesh out the world slightly more, as he does in nearly every single shot. He does this here by having a couple whores or street punks standing by the side of the road. When I played this scene with my commentary rather than the sound, I bet you didn't even notice them. But watch what happens when I shut up and let the scene play as normal. You hear this weird, futuristic techno music slightly obscuring their conversation, and in an attempt to figure out where it's coming from, your eyes shift their focus from the main characters and begin scanning the rest of the scene, eventually settling on the street punks. With this simple fade-in of music, a little bit more is said about the world than would be otherwise. Not only can we infer that there are punks everywhere, but we even know what kind of music they listen to. Tricks like this are used throughout every second of the film, and the end result is that we're constantly being fed information about the world and its characters subconsciously. When looking at films that take place in strange worlds, it's common to have a fish-out-of-water character who asks the same sort of questions that the audience is asking.
Ray, for a moment, pretend that I don't know anything about metallurgy, engineering, or physics, and just tell me what the hell is going on.
Is the dark side stronger?
No.
We learn about the world alongside these characters, and as a result we feel more attached to them and sympathize with them more. Fish-out-of-water protagonists are Exposition 101, but it can definitely feel a little forced, and Children of Men is a great example of when you should avoid a fish-out-of-water main character. Theo has been a part of this world since before Infertility started, just like every other character. So while characters will occasionally explain things to him, seeing as he isn't a member of the fish but is caught up in their business nonetheless, most of the exposition happens through subtleties like those street punks I showed earlier. We're mostly left on our own when it comes to understanding the world of this film, and that, combined with the long takes and handheld, almost documentary-style cinematography, makes it feel like we're in a world that we share with Theo, and all of the refugees he tries to ignore while going about his day. Since Theo isn't much of a fish-out-of-water character, we don't relate to his struggle through the story as much as we would otherwise, but because we're so immersed in the world and its problems, all we want throughout the film is for Theo to help save it by getting this baby to the ship tomorrow. We don't sympathize with the main character as much as we do, say, Luke Skywalker. Rather than immersing us in the character, we're immersed in the world. We see Theo as a tool to save the world. His main objective is to get that baby to safety, and that's all we want to do. So when he dies, his mission complete, we aren't stuck focusing on the negative of his death, we're focusing on the positive of a brighter tomorrow. That's not to say that Theo is a bad character. On the contrary, his tale of redemption and learning to care about his life again is a deep-cutting one, especially given the hopelessness of the entire first act. I do intend to get back to the immersion factor, but let's briefly go over Theo's arc, because it really is a good one. At the start of the film, Theo is completely jaded. He almost gets killed in a bombing at a cafe, and he just wants to take a day off work. He lies to his boss about caring the baby Diego, the world's youngest person, died, and immediately talks to his friend Jasper about how the guy was a wanker.
He was the youngest wanker on Earth.
He carries a bottle of booze and a pack of cigarettes on his person at all times, and the first thing he does when he runs into some money is gamble some of it on a dog race. He's essentially at the cusp of reaching the final stage of grief for the death of humanity, acceptance. But he isn't quite there yet, instead attempting to be completely nihilistic to it all, trying to cover up his pain with booze. However, as he meets his old wife, Julian, again, we see a hint of passion returning to him.
Theo, come on, you came for the money.
Did I?
When Julian dies, he's intent on returning to his old life, his job done. However, when Key says that Julian told her to trust Theo, he finds himself unable to move past the situation, not only because Key is about to have the first baby in 18 years, but because, by telling Key she could trust Theo, Julian is, in a way, giving Theo a second chance at being a father after their baby died. He has a chance to make up for his past, and so he's able to die satisfied when he manages to complete his task.
Put her on your shoulder. Just tap her back.
We even see him sacrifice all his booze to sterilize his hands before delivering the baby, and giving away his entire pack of cigarettes to get Marichka out of Key's hair when she wants him to make her leave. He's completely moved past his attempted nihilism at this point. There's a lot more to his arc, involving accepting the death of his baby and questioning whether it was God's will that so much had gone wrong in his life, but since he's not the main subject of this video, let's skip past that for today, and move back to the subtleties. As I said, this film is packed to the brim with subtleties like the street thugs I mentioned earlier. I could talk about the ads in the background for the government-issued suicide pill, Quietus, or this beautiful visual of a government worker painting over the hopeful graffiti that says the human project lives on, but again, I'm more interested in the sound. Things like the propaganda are all active subtleties, in that you have to consciously read the advertisement to get more information about the world. That's awesome, but the subconscious exposition of radio advertisements and music and other sound is equally important to immersing you in and teaching you about this world. World building is obviously most useful during the first act, when the world of the film is still mostly unknown to us. Thusly, it's packed in extra tightly for the first 45 minutes or so of the film, before we really know much about the isolationist London of this movie. We hear this radio advert in the background.
He's my dentist.
She's my house cleaner. He's the waiter. She's my cousin.
They are illegal immigrants. To hire, feed, or shelter illegal immigrants is a crime.
You can barely even hear the bulk of the ad over the sounds of traffic and conversation, but we're subconsciously fed that information nonetheless, and by allowing us to get this information without having to actively seek it as we do in the propaganda posters, we feel more like we're part of this world. You don't even notice many of the interesting parts of the world around you, but you learn them nonetheless, just like a person actually living in that world. Another great example of this that is visual is the heads-up display in this car. I've seen this movie half a dozen times, and on my most recent viewing, I totally forgot about it until this warning sign popped up indicating the obstruction ahead. You can see the heads-up display prior to this, but it just doesn't stick out like that warning does, so you don't even notice it. If you were actually in this world, you wouldn't even think twice about the displays in these cars, not any more than you think about the speedometer in your actual car, which, if you're anything like me, you'll basically forget exists when you've been driving for a while and your brain goes on autopilot. So, by making us barely even notice the heads-up display until the warning pops up, we again feel like we're in the world of this film, just driving in the country. Which is just emphasized further by the fact that this is one of the longest takes in the film, coming out to 4 minutes and 7 seconds. And yes, I'm aware that some of the long takes in this film have hidden cuts. That doesn't matter to me, simply because they were good enough to fool me on my first couple viewings. If I had to describe the feeling of this film in one word, it would be cluttered. That's definitely a good thing, though, as this film has one of the most lived-in worlds of probably any film I've ever seen. But I also think it might be why the film doesn't stick out in my mind more when I think about the best movies of all time, as it definitely deserves a spot on that list. It's sort of an embarrassment of riches, so much to take in that we're sort of left with a feeling like we didn't even watch the movie. Going back to the sound again, directional audio plays a big role in giving a sense of environment to many of the locations. Looking at Theo's office, we hear the news broadcast about baby Diego being stabbed, and we hear it coming from the side of the room Theo entered from almost exclusively, which tells us that the speaker is on that side of the room. Such a tiny, insignificant detail, but by going that extra mile there, we're just that little bit more immersed, which is especially important this early into the film, as I said earlier. Then, of course, we have the two most obvious creative uses of sound in the film. The sudden loud noises. Interestingly, the first of these is used as a surprise, the second one is used for a bit of comic relief, and both are used to develop two separate characters. The first one is a standout use of a jump scare. Generally, it takes a hell of a lot of build-up for a jump scare to not feel cheap. The best in my mind are in the final act of a long, tense horror film. However, with how immersive just the first scene of this film is, the jump scare doesn't feel cheap at all, at least not to me. I'll just play this out as usual, with a bit of context for those who don't remember. Theo, our protagonist, enters a coffee shop where everyone is crying, staring at a screen as the news reports on the murder of baby Diego, the last person born before infertility. Theo pushes through the crowd, grabs his coffee, and leaves, showing that he doesn't really care that Diego died, and has already lost all his hope for humanity. That is one hell of an introduction to this world. It explains infertility in an interesting, subtle, and powerful way by simply saying world's youngest person and leaving the rest for us to figure out. It shows how hopeless both Theo and the rest of the world has become, and it shows just how dark this movie is going to be as we see a woman walking out of the coffee shop holding her own arm. What's more is that for the next several minutes of the film, we hear the same tinnitus that Theo is struck with after the explosion, a constant reminder of how shaken Theo should be, contrasted with how unfazed by it all he seems. This, combined with him lying about being saddened by Diego's death, really drives home just how little faith he has in humanity's future, to the point where Theo can say things like,
"Same as every other day. Woke up, felt like shit. Went to work, felt like shit.
That's called a hangover, amigo.
At least with a hangover I feel something."
And did not even seem like pretentious writing. If someone were to say something like this in a worse film, it would seem like some quick and dirty character development done by an amateur writer. But since we get to actually see Theo putting this kind of philosophy to practice, this line just emphasizes that Theo has felt like this for a long time. This line isn't so much character development for Theo as it is world building that uses Theo as an example of the average human. Jasper, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of an average human for this world. He sees this whole thing as a hard pill to swallow, but one that he's already swallowed, and is sure as hell going to laugh at now that he's done with it. We even see this contrast between the two characters illustrated in their smoke session. Jasper says something about infertility, and then Theo starts pontificating about the utter hopelessness of it all, when in reality what Jasper said was just the setup of a joke about eating storks.
I'm just trying to tell a joke, man.
So this loud noise in the beginning hasn't fazed Theo an ounce as much as it would someone who had hope for the future, but Jasper just laughs at that sort of thing. Also nihilistic, but in an entirely different way. So the second major loud noise in this film just builds on that.
My ears are still ringing from earlier.
Ah, well, a little Zen music won't bother you then, will it?
Jasper's so-called Zen music is loud, obnoxious, and weird as hell, but he just laughs and plays air guitar at the music that's clearly meant to parallel with the bombing in the introduction. Sound can be world-building, tone-setting, emotion-stirring, but it can also be used to introduce and build on themes, in this case, Theo's alcoholic nihilism versus Jasper's laid-back stoner nihilism. Something else that sound can be great at is accentuating raw emotions. Somebody crying passionately in a foreign language is one fantastic way of getting it across. In this scene, towards the beginning, we see a refugee begging a guard for something in Serbian. I won't bother telling you what it means, because I think that the line is even more powerful if we don't know the translation. All that needs to be taken from this scene can be taken without knowing the translation. The pain and desperation in her voice speaks volumes, and by putting it in foreign language, it's more able to represent the entirety of these people, all of which probably speak different languages. By painting her as just some random woman amongst 100, who the guard probably doesn't even understand, she's able to serve as a microcosm of the entirety of the camp's occupants. We aren't focused on her words, we're focused on the raw human emotion. By making her speak a foreign language, she's showing that her and her peers are human, and that their suffering is just as real whether you can understand them or not. We see a similar foreign language moment again towards the end of the film, when this mother is crying over the loss of her son, or so I assume. Just as with the last example, the camera leaves our main characters behind to focus on a detail in the world. And again, the raw emotion that we get from not knowing what she's saying is more impactful than it would be in English. Whatever she's saying, it's safe to assume she's talking to her god. The refugees have a god, just as most characters in the film do. They aren't so different from the people who aren't in cages, yet they've been forced to suffer so much more than everyone else, even as they probably outweigh the number of people who are native to London. In short, by putting these two lines in a foreign language, the film is subconsciously telling us that these people's problems transcend race, religion, and location. Sure, it's not exactly difficult to do this given their situation, but the film just furthers the empathy we have for the refugees by letting the camera lag behind to focus on these moments. People often say that the best films can be watched silently and you'll still understand the story and themes. Children of Men absolutely has that quality, but on top of that, you could listen to the audio of the whole thing with no accompanying images and still be absolutely moved by the plight of these characters and this world. Visually, technically, directorially, and dramatically, this movie is an absolutely stunning work of art, but the exact same can be said for its audio track. It's like painting with sound. Over the course of this film, you can absolutely hear the death and rebirth of the human race.